In 612 BCE, the greatest empire the world had ever seen ceased to exist in a single season. Not weakened, not reduced, erased. The city of Nineveh, capital of the Assyrian Empire, was sacked, burned, and so completely destroyed that within 2 generations, people were unsure it had ever existed at all. The Greek historian Xenophon marched his army past its ruins in 401 BCE and asked the locals what city it was. No one could tell him. A civilization that had ruled from Egypt to Persia, that had invented the world's first library, that had fielded the most sophisticated military machine the ancient world had ever seen, had been so thoroughly annihilated that its name was already becoming myth. The Book of Nahum, written by a prophet who witnessed the fall of Nineveh, captures the mood of the ancient world in 3 words: Nineveh is desolate. But here is what makes this story genuinely strange. The people who destroyed Nineveh were the Babylonians and the Medes. And 20 years earlier, neither of them would have dared. The Assyrians had been the most feared military power on Earth for 3 centuries. So what happened? And why, when the end came, was it so total that even the memory almost disappeared? To answer that, you have to go back to the beginning, to a small city on the east bank of the Tigris River in what is now northern Iraq that most people have never heard of. The city was called Ashur. Ashur was not born a conqueror. For the first 1,000 years of its existence, it was a trading city. Assyrian merchants had established colonies as far away as Anatolia in modern Turkey by 1900 BCE. The tablets they left behind, the so-called Cappadocian tablets, are the oldest commercial records ever found. Letters between merchants, contracts, complaints about shipments that arrived late. A civilization built not on war but on commerce. There is something worth sitting with here. The Cappadocian tablets, these ancient merchant letters, are not the records of a great civilization announcing itself to history. They are complaints. One tablet, dating to around 1900 BCE, is from a merchant named Nani, furious at a colleague who sold him inferior copper. It is possibly the world's oldest written complaint letter. The Assyrians entered history not as warriors, but as people who were annoyed that their shipments were wrong. That is a more human beginning than most empires get. What changed Ashur was what always changes small powers: the collapse of their neighbors. In the 14th century BCE, the great Mitanni kingdom that had dominated northern Mesopotamia began to fall apart under pressure from the Hittites to the west. Assyria had been a vassal of Mitanni for generations. When Mitanni weakened, the Assyrian king Ashur-uballit I did something unprecedented. He began writing letters to the Egyptian pharaoh Akhenaten on equal terms. Not as a subject, not as a tributary. As a fellow king, Akhenaten's court, accustomed to corresponding only with great powers, reportedly found this presumptuous. They were about to find out it was not. Over the next 3 centuries, the Assyrians expanded, sometimes aggressively, sometimes defensively, almost always successfully. They developed an army that was, for its time, without equal. Iron weapons when the rest of the world still used bronze. Cavalry when most armies still fought primarily from chariots. Siege engines that could breach walls that had never been breached before. And something else. Something that set them apart from every empire that had come before them. Terror as policy. The Assyrian kings did not simply conquer territory. They documented their conquests in meticulous detail on stone reliefs that lined the walls of their palaces. And the things they recorded were not diplomatic victories. They were the things they did to people who resisted. King Ashur-Nirpal II, who ruled from 883 to 859 BCE, left inscriptions that read with a precision that is difficult to process even now. He described flaying captured leaders alive and draping their skins over city walls, impaling prisoners on stakes outside conquered cities, cutting off hands and noses and stacking them in piles. He recorded these things not with shame but with pride. They were meant to be read. They were meant to be spread. They were propaganda, and they worked. The palace reliefs of Ashur-Nirpal II are now in the British Museum and in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. Visitors walk past them. Children on school trips shuffle in front of them. They are extraordinary works of art, carved with a skill and precision that would not be matched in European sculpture for another 1,500 years. And they depict, in extraordinary detail, what the Assyrian army did to people who resisted. They were not hidden in back rooms. They lined the main halls of the palace, where visitors, ambassadors, and tribute-bearing kings would have been brought. The message was deliberate. Look at what we do. Now decide whether you want to resist. Within a generation, cities were surrendering to Assyrian armies before they arrived. The reputation did the work that soldiers would otherwise have had to do. But here is the thing that most accounts of Assyria miss. This was not irrational cruelty. It was calculated strategy. The Assyrians studied the problem of how to run an empire, and they concluded that the primary threat to any empire was the cost of suppressing revolts. Every time a subject population rebelled, you had to send an army, fight a campaign, rebuild governance, and start over. It was expensive, and it was slow. The solution they devised was to make the cost of rebellion so obviously catastrophic that rebellion would not be attempted. Terror was cheaper than occupation, and the policy worked for 200 years. But it was not the only policy. The other policy is the one that surprises people who only know Assyria as conquerors. It was deportation. And deportation in the Assyrian system was not quite what it sounds like. When Tiglath-Pileser III came to the throne in 745 BCE, the empire was in trouble. A series of weak kings had allowed the borders to contract, and 2 devastating plague outbreaks had collapsed the agricultural economy of the Assyrian heartland. He responded with a transformation of the empire so complete that historians sometimes treat him as its real founder. He created the world's first professional standing army. Soldiers who trained year-round, were paid regular salaries, and did not have to go home at harvest time. He reorganized the provinces, replacing local kings with Assyrian governors who reported directly to the crown. And he institutionalized mass deportation on a scale no one had ever attempted. In a single year, according to his own records, 154,000 people were forcibly relocated across the empire. But the details of how this was done matter. Deportees were not killed. They were not enslaved in the classical sense. They were moved with their families intact. They were given food, clothing, and shoes for the journey, as recorded in a letter from an Assyrian official to the king. At their destination, they became Assyrian citizens with the same legal status as the original population. The people selected for deportation were specifically the urban elites, craftsmen, and specialists, the people whose knowledge and skills were most valuable. What the Assyrians were doing was not ethnic cleansing. It was something stranger. They were building the world's first multi-ethnic knowledge economy, pooling human expertise from across the conquered world into the imperial center. Which brings us to the king who sat at the peak of all of this, and the paradox at the heart of his story. Ashurbanipal came to the throne in 668 BCE. He was not supposed to be king. He had an older brother who was the designated heir, and Ashurbanipal had been raised for a different life, one of scholarship. He had learned to read and write, which was extremely unusual for a king. He had studied mathematics, astronomy, and divination. When his brother died and he found himself on the throne of the largest empire in the world, he brought that scholarly instinct with him. His military record was formidable. He conquered Egypt, suppressed rebellions across the empire, and fought wars with Elam to the east that were so devastating that the ancient city of Susa was salted so that nothing would ever grow there again. His own inscriptions boast of it. He was, in every conventional sense, a conqueror in the Assyrian tradition. But in his palace at Nineveh, he was building something that had never existed before. He sent agents across the empire with standing orders to collect texts. Every tablet in every temple, palace, and scribal school was to be copied and sent to Nineveh. Scholars were brought to the capital and given dedicated space to work. When he sacked Babylon during a rebellion, his troops carried off not just gold and silver, but thousands of clay tablets from the temples and archives. When he destroyed Susa, among the items catalogued and transported north were tablets so old that the scribes in Nineveh needed special sign lists just to read them. The library he assembled contained over 30,000 tablets, medical texts, astronomical records, mathematical calculations, the works of mythology and literature that had been accumulating in Mesopotamia for 2,000 years. And at the end of each tablet, his scribes added a colophon, a kind of ownership mark that read, "For the sake of distant days." He was not just collecting knowledge for himself. He understood that he was preserving it for a future he would not live to see. There is a letter in the British Museum from Ashurbanipal himself, written in his own hand, which is extraordinarily rare for an ancient king. In it he describes his love of scholarship. He writes of solving complex mathematical problems and of reading inscriptions in Sumerian, a dead language even then, the equivalent of a modern king reading Linear B. He was proud of this. It was not a hobby. It was, he believed, part of what made him fit to rule. A king who understood the past could navigate the present. He inscribed his name on thousands of tablets not to claim credit but to ensure they would be preserved. Tablets belonging to the palace of Ashurbanipal, king of the world, king of Assyria, he wrote, over and over. A man trying to anchor himself to the future. The greatest irony is that he was right to worry about the future, just not for the reasons he thought. Ashurbanipal's reign was the peak of the Assyrian Empire. It was also the beginning of its end, and the cause was something no military victory could address. The empire had simply become too large for the system that ran it. The Assyrian model required constant expansion. Every year, the army campaigned. Every year, new tribute flowed into the capital. Every year, the provinces had to be policed by governors backed by military force. When expansion slowed, the revenue slowed with it. When the army was tied down suppressing revolts in multiple provinces simultaneously, it could not expand. And when the army could not expand, the economic logic of the empire began to break down. The climate made things worse. Research published in Science Advances has shown that the Assyrian heartland experienced nearly 2 centuries of unusually high rainfall that supported an agricultural boom and enabled the population growth that made the empire possible. In the 7th century BCE, that rainfall pattern shifted. Megadroughts hit the region, not for years but for decades. Harvests failed, grain stores ran out. An empire that had been feeding itself from the surplus of a good climate was now trying to maintain its military commitments from a failing one. And then the succession crisis arrived. Ashurbanipal's long reign created a problem he could not solve. He had multiple sons, and when he died around 631 BCE, they went to war with each other. The empire did not fracture. Slowly, it convulsed. Civil war between brothers pulled the army in multiple directions simultaneously. The Babylonians, who had been restive under Assyrian rule for decades, saw their moment. They made an alliance with the Medes, an Iranian people from the east who had their own reasons to want Assyria destroyed. Together, they moved against Nineveh. The city fell in 612 BCE. The destruction was, by the account of every ancient source, total. The Assyrian king died in the burning palace. The population was killed or scattered. The city was not just conquered. It was erased from the landscape. Other Assyrian cities fell in the following years, and by 605 BCE, the last remnants of Assyrian resistance had been extinguished. The people who destroyed Nineveh were not subtle about their motivations. These were not rivals absorbing a great power into their own system. These were subject peoples taking revenge. Every city the Assyrians had ever burned, every population they had ever deported, every king they had ever flayed and hung from a city wall, came back in the form of enemies who were not satisfied with defeating Assyria. They wanted to make sure it could never recover, which is why, when Xenophon marched past the ruins less than 2 centuries later, no one could tell him what city it was. The city of Mosul in northern Iraq sits today approximately across the Tigris from the ruins of Nineveh. The tablets from Ashurbanipal's library are in the British Museum, where they were taken after excavations in the 1850s. Among them is the oldest surviving copy of the Epic of Gilgamesh, a story about a king who seeks immortality and fails, written by people who had been dead for 2,000 years by the time the British archaeologist Austen Henry Layard dug it out of the ground. When George Smith, a young banknote engraver who studied the tablets in his lunch breaks at the British Museum, deciphered one of them in 1872 and found a flood story almost identical to the story of Noah. He reportedly stood up from his desk and began removing his clothes in excitement. He had just discovered that the biblical flood narrative was not original. It had been borrowed from a civilization so old that people had forgotten it existed. That is the legacy of Assyria. Not the empire, not the terror, not even the library, though the library was extraordinary. The legacy is that through the library, things survived that would otherwise have been lost forever. The Assyrian king who salted the earth of his enemies also preserved the knowledge of civilizations that had come before him. And the fire that destroyed his palace in 612 BCE, the fire that his enemies set to erase him from history, baked his clay tablets harder and preserved them for the next 2,500 years. Ashurbanipal wrote, for the sake of distant days. He had no idea how distant those days would be, or that we would still be reading them.